Hey everybody, RaccoonChad here. Welcome to the final boss. For this one, it's going to be a little bit different. What I wanted to do with this particular podcast is take an interview that I did with my friend Aron Miller. He's been playing Warhammer 40k, the tabletop game, for about 9 years. Sometimes I would ask him about games that he's played, and one of the things that was always the most interesting to me that I always ended up asking more about was Warhammer 40k and the lore behind it, because it just seemed really interesting, and he's really knowledgeable on it. He's got his own figures. I don't even know how many armies, but definitely more than one. He's painted them all. So this podcast is going to consist of the lore of Warhammer 40k, more particularly the Imperium of Man, Horus Heresy. Aaron's just going to give us a quick rundown of the main takeaways of it. But first what he's going to do is he's going to tell us the history behind the Warhammer franchise. He's going to give us the setting, what some of the units would look like. He's also going to go into detail about some of the units that he talks about. Like the first one that he describes to us is called a Psyker. So without further ado, Aron Miller.
Hey Chad.
Please tell us about the lore of Warhammer 40k.
Well, 40k is a very old game. It's been evolving from its original process as a rogue trader for over probably about 20 years now. And the company that owns and has created Warhammer 40k has been around for over 25 years now, working on various different systems. But the 40k lore is based in the 41st millennia, and the whole timetable is pretty expansive, and it's kind of an exciting time to be in 40k right now because they're really fleshing out things that have been hush-hush or whispered, and that mostly revolves around the Horus Heresy, which happened about 10,000 years in the future, the 31st millennia. And so in the 41st millennia, mankind has explored out from the stars. This happened tens of thousands of years ago. And they're under one source of leadership, under the Imperium of Man, much like kind of Rome was. And I guess Rome is a good way to look at it. And there's the Emperor, who started the Imperium of Man and tried to reconnect all the lost colonies across the stars. And this happened 10,000 years ago, so the 31st millennia. So the Emperor is basically in a coma-like stasis, and he's on something called the Golden Throne. And he acts as the Astronomicon, which is the Emperor. And the Emperor is the most powerful psychic in the universe. And so, by sitting on the Golden Throne, they have to feed him 1,000 souls of potential psychers every day to just keep him alive. But the Imperium is so large that they can easily do this. And he basically acts as like the northern star of the entire Imperium. And so you can go anywhere, and if you have a psyker or a navigator on board your ship, he should be able to tap into the warp and find the Astronomicon. So a beacon of light that can be seen anywhere in the universe through psychers. In 40k, there's not technically quote magic unquote. What you have instead are psychers. A psyker is something or someone who is able to tap into what is called the warp. And so in the 40k lore, you have the real time or real world, and then you have the warp. And so the warp is the stuff of chaos, and chaos is like the ultimate evil of the 41st millennia. And so a psyker will tap into the warp, and not all psychers can do all the same things. There's different psychers, and they go to different schools of training under the Imperium of Man. And there's ones that navigate ships, there's ones that send out messages, there's ones that are able to utilize powers into a physical form and can go into battle and do things like that. Because the Imperium of Man is literally like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of planets, they don't have anything like light speed or something like that, like in Star Wars. How they travel is by going through the warp. Trying not to get too far off topic from the basic mechanics of the 41st millennium, the stuff of chaos is, again, the ultimate evil. It's broken up into 4 gods of chaos. And there's Khorne, which is the epitome of rage and hate, battle, bloodlust. There's Tzeentch, which is the god of foresight and psychers. There's Slaanesh, which is the god of perversion and basically giving into what you really want. Anything that feels good is what Slaanesh is all about. And then the last one is Nurgle. And Nurgle is the god of decay, rot, and disease. And the gods don't necessarily like each other. Some of them hate each other, and some of them are okay. So, for example, Tzeentch and Nurgle hate each other because Nurgle is all about decay and kind of keeping things the same-ish, and Tzeentch is all about forethought and stuff like that. And then Khorne and Slaanesh don't get along, and none of them really get along. And what'll happen is, if one of them gets more powerful than the other, then the other three will kind of band together a little bit and bring the other one back into place. So never any one of them being more dominant than the other. But it's just constantly, the reason they call it chaos is because there's no order to it. Stuff is just going out of control all the time. And so there's demons to each one of the gods. And then there's greater demons, and there's lesser demons, and there's all sorts of different types that are represented in the game. And there's even more that are represented in the fluff that don't have models or stats in the game. And then on top of that, there's undivided demons as well. So demons that don't have a mark per se. They don't belong to a specific god. And these all reside in the warp. And they can become material, but not for very long. And so they basically try and get out of the warp through physical followers, like humans that have been turned to chaos, basic occultists, and try and release themselves to do as much damage as they possibly can before they get dematerialized and sucked back into the warp. And so their ships will have a psyker on it, and they basically open a hole in the warp and they dip into it, but they have to be constantly protected by, I can't exactly remember what it's called, but it's like a Geiger force field or something like that, because the whole warp is the stuff of chaos. And if these force fields were to fall apart for whatever reason, the ship would be completely and utterly consumed by demons or warp storms and stuff like that. And so, for the Imperium of Man to travel through to get from one planet to the other, the only way that they can do this in a reasonable amount of time is by going through the warp, so by just going through pure chaos. And so they have to use psychers to do this, but this isn't enough. The only way that they're actually able to traverse the warp is with the Astronomicon. This doesn't always mean that he can see it, because the warp is kind of like an ocean, and there's storms. So there might be huge disturbances in the warp and massive warp storms, and then he loses sight of the Astronomicon. You get lost in the warp, and you basically have to get out as quickly as possible. And this doesn't always mean that you can, and ships get lost in the warp all the time, or the warp, it's not on the same time scale as real time. So, for example, an hour inside the warp is not the same as in the material realm, but there's no way to figure out how long it is. It's constantly in fluctuation. So ships will go in and they'll come out on the other side of the universe in an hour. And ships will go in and they're supposed to get to the next star system, and they'll be gone for 20 years. And ships will just randomly appear out of the warp, and their crew is completely gone, and all the records on the ship are completely wiped, all the logs and stuff like that. So it's very dangerous, but it's a necessary evil that the Imperium Man has to use if they're going to stay connected. And in the history of the Imperium, or the history of the Astronomicon working, it's only turned off once, and in that time it was just like, supposedly it wasn't for very long, but in that time thousands of worlds and ships basically lost contact, and any ship that was in the warp at that given time was completely screwed and was lost or attacked or something like that. And the longer you spend in the warp, the more likely it is that you'll either be lost or that you will be farther away from your destination. I guess I didn't say that very well. If you make a short jump and you want to be at a specific world, for example, you make a short jump, you have a really good chance of coming out right next to that world. But if you're making a very long jump, it's better to do short successive jumps to add up to that long jump. So think of it like you're on a plane and you're flying somewhere. You can fly direct, but it's going to be more expensive and it's going to take a long time, and you're just in a big metal tube. But you can do smaller flights. Now the difference is, when you're doing this in real life, you're not going to end up in a different city or something like that if you go on a direct route. But this is like a real evil that they have to deal with when using the warp. So it's better to do a bunch of medium-sized jumps instead of just doing one long jump. So that's how the Imperium of Man is able to stay in contact with each other. And again, the main evil of the Imperium of Man is chaos, and that's kind of not how it's always been, but for how it's been for the last 10,000 years. And man hasn't always known about chaos, and that's part of what's so exciting about 40K right now is the Horus Heresy is the first introduction to chaos that the Imperium of Man had. And we didn't know a lot about the Horus Heresy up until just a couple of years ago, and they started, Games Workshop has their own publishing company called the Black Library, and they've always been doing books, but up until fairly recently they started doing the Horus Heresy novels. And so they had Graham McNeill and Dan Abnett, which are their two best writers. Dan Abnett being, when they started out, was miles ahead of Graham McNeill, but Graham McNeill is getting a lot better. But they started writing all of the Horus Heresy books, and then they bring other writers in to write some of the other ones. And it was very exciting because it was kind of like this dark part of the lore. There was nothing about it, and there was just lots of kind of conspiracy theories and people that had different ideas on different hints. And so the fact that they're starting to come out and give us definitive answers is very, very cool. And on top of that, they're great works of fiction. So, that being said, chaos, again, ultimate evil. There's 4 different gods, and their whole goal is to corrupt the Imperium of Man and to corrupt mankind. And man, being what a human is very easy to corrupt. And so the Imperium has tried to put in a series of checks and balances to help stop that. So they have basically a human military system called the Imperial Guard, which it's kind of like our Marines or something like that. And then they have what are called Space Marines, which are genetically altered superhumans that started out as a human being but have gone through a whole number of procedures and surgeries to instill extra things into their body to make them grow larger and do all this different stuff. And then they were given extremely powerful armor, more powerful weapons, more durable weapons. They're given the best technologies and things like that. And then even on top of that, you have what are called the Grey Knights. But nobody in the Imperium, or the average person in the Imperium, knows about the Grey Knights, because the Grey Knights are solely there to combat demonic incursions and stuff like that. So for example, if the Grey Knights needed to defeat like a demon world or something like that, or there was a warp gate that was going to be opened onto a world and demons were going to come out, and they couldn't tackle it alone, they might use an Imperial Guard regiment. And let's say they defeat the demons and they're gone. The Grey Knights turn around and they kill all the guardsmen. Because they've been in contact with demons, they don't know if they're going to be a host for a demon or if they've been completely corrupted. They don't want to take any chances. So they kill them all, and then they write it off as some bureaucratic glitch in the system so that nobody asks any questions. If the same thing happens, but instead of Imperial Guardsmen, it's Space Marines, they wipe the Space Marines' memories. Space Marines are too valuable to just kill like Guardsmen. So they wipe their memories. And all of the Grey Knights are minor level psychers so that they can help protect themselves against the incursion of demonic forces trying to influence them. I guess I need to explain Space Marines even more, because that's what the Imperium of Man and 40K as a whole is very much about, because Games Workshop probably not have survived as long as it has if it wasn't for the concept of the Space Marine. In the fluff, the Emperor was creating this new type of super soldier called the Space Marine. And at the same time, he was creating 20 suns. And so each one of these suns was a different Primarch, and each one was supposed to embody some part of the Emperor. The Emperor was being the perfect being, so he couldn't have 20 perfect children, so he kind of broke it up a little bit. And there was some sort of disaster, and the 20 children, or the 20 Primarchs, are scattered all over the universe. They were supposedly on Terra, and they weren't yet complete. They weren't like out and walking around and communicating with their father, the Emperor, or anything like that. They're still in capsules or something like that. And they were almost finished, and then there was some horrible accident. As far as my knowledge, again, I haven't been keeping up on the fluff as much as I probably should have in the last couple of years, but they were scattered across the stars. And I mean, they were the Emperor's children. They were the only children that he had ever had and will ever have. So he wanted to rediscover them. And so he went out to try and find them. And not only that, but he wanted to reconnect all of the lost colonies, because there had been a great cataclysm and man had basically fallen apart back to Terra, or Earth. As the Emperor found or discovered the Primarchs, he gave the Primarchs a different chapter, and sometimes the Primarchs would rename the chapter or whatever. Eventually, once he discovered all 20, there were 20 chapters, and as soon as a Primarch was discovered, they would then take the Primarch's gene seed, and they would take a small bit of that, it's basically a form of DNA, and they would copy it, and then implant it into the Space Marines. It's a very timely process. You can't have a Space Marine without gene seed. And so from that point on, there were original Terra Space Marines, and then there were Space Marines under the Primarch, and so they had attributes of that Primarch. So, for example, there was a Space Marine chapter, or still is, called the World Eaters. They're very aggressive because their Primarch's name is Angron, and he, after he had been lost, he had been on a gladiatorial-style planet, and so they had put all of these things that would inject, like, steroids into his body. He was extremely aggressive and very violent, and so all the Space Marines, after they had rediscovered Angron, were very aggressive, straight to the point, very, very, like, get-in-your-face kind of attitude. So there was, again, 20 of these. He was trying to the Emperor was trying to connect all the lost colonies. And we actually only know about 18 of them. 2 of the Primarchs and 2 of the Space Marine chapters, no idea. They've been erased from the records. There's no fluff on them whatsoever. It's just this black mark. And again, there's all these conspiracy theories. And I haven't been keeping up on the Horus Heresy books, unfortunately, but supposedly there might be whispers of like what happened to them and stuff like that. So he's leading the Great Crusade, and so he's discovered all of the Primarchs, and they all have their legions, and he's expanding the boundaries of the Imperium once again, and he's reconnecting lost colonies that have been fighting on their own, and they don't want to be reconnected into the realm of humanity and stuff like that. They're discovering new alien species and different worlds, and blah, blah, blah. And so the Emperor decides that things are going really well, and that he has some sort of secret project that he's going to go back and work on. You have to keep in mind that nobody knows about chaos yet. The Chaos Gods haven't decided to influence the real world or mankind yet. And the Emperor has to appoint a leader. So he appoints his favorite son, Horus, who's the leader of the Alpha Legion. So he becomes the new War Master of the Crusade. And there's a problem with this, because Horus isn't technically better or a higher rank than any of the other Primarchs, because they're equals. And so other Primarchs are very angry about this. And so there's some contention and stuff like that. Through a series of events, the Chaos Gods start influencing the material realm. And specifically, they start doing this through Horus. And there's another legion called the Word Bearers. And one important thing is that at this time, there was no religion. The Emperor decided that religion was a barbaric thing, and that the only thing close to religion that needed to be worshipped was science, was machinery, and was truth and logic. And so the Word Bearers really, really, really wanted to worship the Emperor as a god. And he's like, no, you can't do that. And he basically scolded them and said, stop doing that. And they really wanted something to worship. And so the Chaos Gods saw this, and they started getting in contact with them. And the word bearer is like, oh wow, there's actual gods out there that we haven't known about. And these aren't just like gods that we thought up or anything like that. These are gods that can affect us, and they're giving us gifts and making us stronger. And so there were things called chaplains, and they were supposed to keep up morale and stuff like that. And so there was a chaplain named, if I remember correctly, his name was Arubis, and he was working with Horus, and he was slowly trying to get Horus to understand chaos. And through a series of events, I don't want to spoil it because it's the first 3 books that all of this happens. But Horus falls, I mean, we know where it leads to, but Horus falls to chaos. And he's like, wow, chaos is, like, the gods of chaos are so much better than we thought anything else was. And Horus felt betrayed by the Emperor, that the Emperor had basically left and locked himself up in Terra working on something. And he wouldn't even tell Horus what he was working on. So Horus was pretty pissed off about that. And so what he did is he knew that some of the Primarchs and the Legionnaires of the Space Marines were going to be loyal towards the Emperor no matter what. But he knew that some of them might not be. And so what he did is he started getting in contact with various Primarchs, and he was talking and discussing about a rebellion, or a great heresy. And it eventually came down to, he was able to get 9 chapters. And so there was 9 heretic chapters and 9 heretic chapters, 9 loyalist chapters. But I guess I shouldn't even call them chapters, because they're not chapters, they're legions, and there's a big difference. Every time I said chapters, just think of it as legions. And the reason that that's a big difference is because there used to be, at this time, there was no cap on how many Space Marines could be in a legion. You could just have thousands. You could have 20,000. You could have 100,000. Whereas in 40K, as in the 41st millennia, the common date for the game, there's chapters, and you can only have 1,000 Space Marines in a chapter. There's a specific reason for that. So back to the first millennium, Horus is starting to think about stuff and trying to get everything set in motion. And there's a series of massacres. There's Istvan III, where he weeds out all of the loyalists within his chapter and several other chapters. And then there's the Istvan IV drop site massacre, where they're supposedly going into a holdout world that they're trying to bring back into the Imperium of Man. And there's several loyalist chapters, like the Salamanders and the Raven Guard. I think there's a third one, I can't remember. And as they're dropping down in their drop pods, there's also traitor legions there, like the Word Bearers, I think were there. The Iron Warriors, I know, were there. And so while the Loyalist Marines were trying to fight the actual inhabitants of the world and do their mission, the Heretic Marines were turning around and shooting them in the back. And they were basically able to wipe out 2 to 3 chapters in one go. And at this time, there were stragglers who were trying to get in contact with the rest of the Imperium and tell them what was going on. And the Warp was even coinciding with Horus, and they were blocking off worlds and having huge storms, so messages couldn't get through. And long story short, it was a huge, huge war that ended with the heretics ultimately losing, but in the process, the Emperor was put into a coma, because it came down to a fight between Horus and the Emperor, and the Emperor basically didn't want to kill his favorite son, and he was trying to talk to him while Horus was stabbing and hacking him apart. And basically, right before Horus killed him, the Emperor unleashed his psychic and obliterated Horus. But in the process of doing so, he put himself in a coma. And then he was discovered by Rogel Dorn, who was the Primarch of the Iron Fist. And so the Loyalists were eventually able to push back the heretics back into the Warp. But in the process, more than half of the Imperium was completely torn apart. And even more so, most of the Primarchs were killed. Or if they weren't killed, they were lost into the Warp. Or I guess not lost into the Warp, but they went into the Warp to try and hunt down more heretics, and they haven't been seen for 10,000 years. Or they as well have been put into coma-like states. And so, after all of this happened, they realized that they couldn't have legions anymore, because there was way too many Marines under one kind of section or order. And so they divided them into 1,000 Marine groups. So for example, if a legion still, let's say they had 3,000 Marines, Marines. And they're like, well, you have 3,000 Marines. We got to break it up into 1,000 increment. So one of you can be the first founding chapter, like the Iron Fist. And then the other two can be a second founding chapter. You have to change your name, and you basically have to become a separate organization, and you have to go and find a world and have that be your home base. And then you can go from there, but you can't ever have more than 1,000 Space Marines in your chapter. And there's a couple chapters that don't hold to this. One of them are the Space Wolves. They're kind of like the rogue loyalist chapter. I don't know if that's a good way to put it, but they're just kind of the guys that are too cool for school and don't want to follow the rules and stuff like that. And they're kind of mutants in a way. They had some sort of mutation in their gene seed, and they're kind of like werewolves almost. And so they have more than 1,000. And then the other one that comes to mind are the Black Templars. And they're basically like, we're so religious that we'll never turn, and they have thousands of them. But it was after the Horus Heresy, the notion of no religion went away, and the Emperor started to be worshipped as a god. And because he wasn't there to say, no, don't worship me, everybody just started worshiping him. And so now it's a cult, and he's technically the only god you're supposed to worship, but there's a second, slightly lesser god called the Machine God. And I won't really get into that because that's a whole other can of worms. But, so that's basically the Horus Heresy 40k in a nutshell. And then there's a bunch of other races and aliens like the Tyranids, Tau, Orcs, Eldar, Dark Eldar are all kind of running around and doing their own thing. But the whole concept of 40k is that mankind is crumbling and they're on the back foot. So again, the Roman Empire is a perfect example. It's what they stage the Imperium of Man off of. There's literally barbarians at the gate everywhere, and they're desperately trying to push everything back, but they can't. And everything is either being corrupted or slowly eroded, or bureaucracy inside the Imperium's government is just so thick and so impossible to deal with that things just fall apart. And the motto of 40k is the grim darkness of the 41st millennium. And so a joke that a lot of people have is just grim dark. And they just say that, like, grim dark, and there's skulls on everything, and nobody's happy, and if you are, you just get punched in the face with sadness, and that type of thing. Another thing about Games Workshop is they've never come up with an original idea. Almost nothing that they've done is original. They take it from somewhere. It's either Tolkien or popular culture, something like that, real life, for example, the Roman Empire analogy. But what Games Workshop has done that's so great is they took all of these bits from real life and fiction and everything, and then they brought together and they were able to make it work in such a way that it's seamless. And it seems like they've created this expansive universe, and they have, but they've done it on the backs of others. And that's not to say that that's bad. I mean, that's really good, because they've done an amazing job with it, and it doesn't really represent anything that it started out as or where they got that first idea from. But basically everything is a reference in 40k. So for example, you made the Russian comment. The Imperial Guard is the Russian military. It's set up exactly like Russia's military. And they even have commissars that walk around and shoot people for not doing what they're supposed to do. And it's a model. They have several models, and they have rules, and they work in the Imperial Guard army. And I mean, it's the exact same thing with fantasy, which is the kind of Dungeons and Dragons-esque Tolkien fantasy, run around with elves and stuff. That's all taken from other stuff, real life, Tolkien, other fantasy genres and things like that, legends, but it's brought together very well. So that's kind of the whole idea and the concept of 40k. I'm sure somebody else who's been actually keeping up with the books, 22 right now, and I started playing it in middle school, so like 13 or something. But the last couple of years I haven't been playing it just because I got burnt out on it. I used to be into tournament circuits and stuff like that, and just playing it hardcore for like 6-7 years, like, you just want to change the pace.
Thanks, Aaron. If you liked or disliked this podcast, please leave your comments below. Either or both would be really appreciated. If you're interested in Warhammer lore or the tabletop game, check out your local hobby shop or local games workshop and ask around. After all, you won't get answers unless you ask a few questions. Thanks for listening, and take a look around our website, trollstompgaming.com, and see some of the other articles, videos, and blogs we have for you. This has been RaccoonChad of TrollStomp Gaming.